January 1945. A dimly lit command trailer in Zandhoven, Belgium. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool and stale cigarette smoke. Outside, the Battle of the Bulge is finally dying down. The snow stained black with powder burns. Inside, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery sits alone. He is not looking at a map. He is not checking casualty reports. He is staring at a typewriter. His fingers move with precise, lethal intent. Clack, clack, clack. The words appearing on the paper are not orders for an artillery barrage against the Germans. They are a targeted assassination attempt against his own boss, Dwight D. Eisenhower. In this secret telegram, intended only for the eyes of the British High Command in London, Montgomery commits the ultimate sin of coalition warfare. He doesn't just criticize the American strategy, he attacks the American soldier. He calls the men bleeding in the Ardennes brave but useless. He describes the U.S. command structure as a complete shambles. Montgomery believes this telegram will be his ticket to supreme power. The moment he finally wrests control of the war from the Americans, he seals the envelope, confident that his political maneuvering is invisible. He is wrong. The telegram isn't just a complaint. It is a lit fuse that is about to blow the Allied alliance apart. To understand why a British field marshal would stab his American allies in the back while the war was still raging, you have to look past the propaganda reels of smiling generals shaking hands. The special relationship between the US and UK in 1944 was a toxic marriage held together only by a common enemy. On one side was Dwight D. Eisenhower, the chairman of the board. Ike wasn't a tactical genius. He was a manager of egos. He held the coalition together with endless patience, chain-smoking 4 packs of Camels a day, mediating disputes between generals who hated each other more than they hated the Nazis. He represented the new American superpower, industrial, democratic, and overwhelmingly numerous. On the other side was Bernard Montgomery. Monty was the hero of El Alamein, the man who had beaten Rommel. He was brilliant, meticulous, and insufferably arrogant. He represented the fading British Empire, desperate to maintain its prestige in a war it could no longer afford. Monty didn't view Eisenhower as a superior. He viewed him as a nice chap who should be handling the logistics, while the real professionals, the British, handled the fighting. For months, the tension had been simmering under the surface. Monty believed the war was dragging on because the Americans were too aggressive, too sloppy, and too spread out. He wanted a single, concentrated thrust into Germany, led, of course, by him. Eisenhower refused. The resentment built up in Montgomery like pressurized steam in a boiler, waiting for a crack in the system to escape. That crack opened in the frozen forests of the Ardennes when the Germans launched their massive surprise offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944. The Allied front line shattered. American units were overrun, communications were cut, and panic began to spread through the rear echelons. To Montgomery, this catastrophe was not a tragedy. It was a vindication. From his headquarters in the north, Monty looked at the map with a smug sense of, "I told you so." In his mind, the chaos in the American sector was proof of what he had been saying all along. The Americans were amateurs. They were undisciplined cowboys who had overextended themselves and were now paying the price. He genuinely believed that the U.S. Army was on the verge of total collapse, and that only a steady professional British hand could save them from annihilation. This was the savior complex in full effect. Montgomery didn't see himself as a partner coming to help a friend. He saw himself as a stern headmaster coming to discipline unruly schoolboys. He assumed that once he stepped in and tidied up the mess, the Americans would be grateful. He expected them to bow down to his superior intellect and gladly hand over the reins of the entire war effort. He believed that Washington and London would finally see the truth, that Eisenhower was unfit to lead. Blinded by his own ego, Monty failed to see the one thing that mattered most: the resilience of the American GI. And that blindness was about to lead him into the biggest political minefield of the war. The crisis began with a necessary but dangerous decision. On December 19, 1944, the German Panzer armies had punched a hole 45 feet into the Allied lines. The Bulge had physically severed General Omar Bradley's communications with his northern forces. Eisenhower, looking at the logistics, made a purely tactical call. At 10:30 a.m. on December 20th, he temporarily transferred command of the U.S. First Army under Courtney Hodes and the U.S. 9th Army under William Simpson to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Overnight, Montgomery gained control of 200,000 American soldiers and thousands of tanks. It was a massive transfer of power involving the movement of two entire armies across the command boundary. Montgomery did not treat this as a temporary loan. He treated it as a hostile takeover. He immediately halted the American counterattacks. He reorganized the lines with agonizing slowness, refusing to move until every unit was perfectly positioned while the American 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastonia, fighting off 7 German divisions and screaming for relief. Montgomery held the northern flank stationary. He brought in his own liaison officers, young, arrogant British majors, who lectured veteran American commanders on basic tactics. He vetoed Bradley's plans to pinch off the Bulge at the base. By December 26th, General Patton had broken the siege of Bastonia from the south, moving 3 divisions 100 meters in 48 hours in a blizzard. Yet in the north, Montgomery sat still, tidying up his lines, treating the American armies like new toys he refused to share. But his silence on the battlefield was matched by his noise on the telegraph wires. Between December 25, 1944, and January 1, 1945, the telegraph lines between Belgium and London burned with toxicity. Montgomery bypassed the chain of command entirely. He didn't write to Eisenhower. He wrote secret letters to Field Marshal Alan Brookie, the chief of the Imperial General Staff in London. In a telegram dated December 27th, Montgomery wrote, "The Americans are in a complete shambles. There is no grip anywhere." He claimed that without him, the entire front would have collapsed. He explicitly demanded that he be given full operational control of all ground forces, effectively demoting Eisenhower to a figurehead. He didn't stop at military criticism. He attacked the character of the U.S. Army. In a letter on December 29th, he stated that American troops were brave but useless because they lacked proper training and leadership. He ignored the fact that by this point, the U.S. Army had suffered 75,000 casualties in the Ardennes alone, 19,000 killed in action, holding the line against the SS Panzer divisions. These telegrams were not just complaints. They were political dynamite. Montgomery was effectively lobbying the British government to stage a coup against the American High Command. He was so confident in his assessment that he didn't even bother to encrypt some of his sentiments effectively, assuming his prestige protected him. He was playing a game of poker with the highest stakes imaginable, betting his career against the patience of the United States. He was about to go Allen with a hand that was much weaker than he realized. The explosion didn't happen in a secret bunker. It happened in front of the world press. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery called a press conference at his headquarters. He stood before dozens of reporters for exactly 30 minutes. What followed was one of the most tone-deaf public relations disasters in military history. In his speech, Montgomery used the word I 57 times. He described the Battle of the Bulge not as a desperate defensive stand by American troops, but as a masterpiece of his own generalship. He claimed he had employed the whole available power of the British group of armies to save the Americans. The data proves this was a lie. In reality, the British XXX Corps had engaged mainly in the final stages of the battle. The casualty statistics tell the true story. The Americans suffered 89,000 casualties in the Bulge. The British suffered 1,400. Yet, listening to Montgomery, one would think he had single-handedly stopped Hitler's Panzers, while the Americans cowered in the snow. He barely mentioned General Bradley. He didn't mention Patton's heroic relief of Bastonia. He painted a picture of a frantic, disorganized American rabble being rescued by the cool, calm British professional. When the transcript of this press conference reached General Omar Bradley's headquarters, the usually mild-mannered Bradley turned purple. He walked to his map board, slammed his fist against it, and told his staff that he would never take an order from Montgomery again. The secret was out. The insult was public, and the alliance was effectively dead. The news reached Eisenhower's headquarters at Versailles like a physical blow. Ike was a man of infinite compromise, a man who had swallowed his pride 1,000 times to keep the peace. But reading the transcript of Montgomery's press conference and seeing the intelligence reports of the secret telegrams to London, something inside him finally snapped. He sat at his desk, the cigarette smoke swirling around him in the cold light. He didn't shout. He didn't throw things. He simply pulled a piece of paper from his drawer and began to draft a cable to General George Marshall in Washington. It was an ultimatum. The text was polite, bureaucratic, and absolutely lethal. Eisenhower wrote that he and Montgomery could no longer work together. He stated clearly, "It is him or me." He asked to be relieved of his command if Montgomery was not removed. This was the nuclear option. Eisenhower knew that Washington supplied 70% of the troops and 80% of the supplies in Europe. He knew who Marshall would choose. He was effectively putting a gun to the head of the British Empire and pulling the trigger. The cable was prepared for encryption, but before it could be sent, a terrifying realization hit the British liaison officer, Major General Francis de Guingand. He saw the draft. He saw the end of the war effort. He rushed to the phone to call the one man who could stop the madness. When Winston Churchill received word of Eisenhower's ultimatum, the blood drained from his face. Churchill was a romantic, but he was also a realist. He looked at the numbers. The British Empire was bankrupt. Its manpower reserves were exhausted. They were relying on American lend-lease for everything from tanks to Spam. If Eisenhower resigned, or if he forced the firing of Montgomery, the American public would turn against Britain. The alliance would fracture. Stalin would be the only winner. Churchill realized that his spoiled child Monty had finally pushed the Americans too far. Churchill summoned his staff. The adoration he usually held for Montgomery evaporated instantly. This wasn't about military strategy anymore. It was about survival. He knew he couldn't just smooth this over with a speech. He needed to crush Montgomery's ego. And he needed to do it immediately. He dispatched Dwingan back to Montgomery's HQ with a simple message. Ike has the gun to your head, and he is going to pull the trigger. You have 24 hours to apologize, or you are finished. Why did it come to this? How could a brilliant general like Montgomery be so politically blind? The root cause lay in the fundamental difference between the British and American ways of war. Montgomery viewed war as a set piece, a chessboard, where the grandmaster moves the pieces. He believed that rank and experience entitled him to respect. He failed to understand that the American center of gravity wasn't strategy. It was logistics and production. The Americans didn't need a master. They needed a coordinator. Churchill understood this. He knew that the era of British dominance was over. In his message to Montgomery, he didn't appeal to their friendship. He appealed to the cold, hard facts of geopolitical power. He effectively told Montgomery, "We are the junior partner now. You cannot insult the man who pays your bills and supplies your tanks." It was a brutal lesson in humility. Montgomery had spent his life believing he was indispensable. Churchill forced him to realize that in the face of American industrial might, no single British general mattered. The useless Americans were actually the owners of the company, and Monty was just an employee who had forgotten his place. The scene in Montgomery's caravan that night was pitiful. The arrogant warlord was gone. In his place sat a shaken small man. Dingon stood over him, practically dictating the terms of his surrender. Montgomery took his pen and wrote a letter to Eisenhower. It was the most difficult document of his life. "Dear Ike," it began, "I am distressed that my press conference has caused you trouble. I would never do anything to hurt you." But then came the line that Churchill and Dwight had forced out of him, the full retraction. "Your American soldiers are brave and fighting magnificently. It is an honor to serve beside them." He signed it, "Your very devoted subordinate, Monty." Subordinate. He had finally admitted it. He sent the letter. Eisenhower, reading it the next morning, didn't gloat. He simply took his resignation draft, crumpled it up, and threw it in the trash. He replied with a short note, "Thanks, Monty. Let's get on with the war." The crisis was diffused, but the relationship was permanently altered. The apology saved Montgomery's job, but it killed his influence. From that day forward, Eisenhower stopped listening to London. The strategy shifted decisively. When the time came to cross the Rhine into Germany, Montgomery demanded a grand, deliberate operation in the north. Eisenhower allowed it, but he also unleashed Patton and Bradley in the south. While Montgomery spent weeks preparing a massive artillery barrage, Patton slipped his tanks across the river quietly, stealing the glory of being the first across the Rhine. The broad front strategy that Monty hated became the law of the land. The American armies raced across Germany, leaving the British 21st Army Group to clean up the flanks. By May 1945, the U.S. Army in Europe numbered over 3 million men. The British contribution was dwarfed. The secret telegrams and the insults of January had ensured that, when the victory photos were taken, the Americans would be standing in the center and the British would be standing to the side. History remembers the Battle of the Bulge for the snow, the shrapnel, and the courage of the 101st Airborne. But the most dangerous moment of that winter didn't happen in a foxhole. It happened in a telegraph office. Winston Churchill's intervention did more than just soothe a bruised ego. It saved the Western Alliance from self-destruction. He recognized what Montgomery could not, that in coalition warfare, words are as lethal as bullets. Montgomery called the Americans useless. History proved him wrong, but it took the threat of being fired and a harsh lesson from his own prime minister to force him to see the truth. In the end, the alliance survived not because the generals liked each other, but because one man had the power to say enough, and the other had the wisdom to listen. The telegrams were buried in the archives. The war moved on, but the scar remained.